Archmage is perhaps the most popular class in Tales of Maj'Eyal, and it makes sense. It's easy to unlock, very powerful, and also easy to understand. You can simply pick one of the elements, take all the talents for it, and it will work. But not all of the elements are equal. Fire is commonly talked about as perhaps the best, and its defining feature is Cleansing Flames, which lets you remove debuffs from you while removing buffs from enemies. Lightning, or Air, is not far behind. All of its talents are excellent. Chain Lightning can clear entire rooms by itself, while you don't even need to have vision. It has really good sustains, and it eventually lets you apply Daze with all of your lightning spells, which is sort of like a temporary stun. Then you have Arcane, which does not have any twist. It is just purely damage. It rewards you for only using arcane spells to deal tons of damage, but to be honest, all of the Archmage trees deal a ton of damage, so Arcane definitely feels a little weaker, but it's still really good. I have a video on Arcane Technomancer, which I really enjoyed playing. And then we get to the two least popular categories, at least as far as I can tell from reading forums. Now, spoiler alert, whatever way you decide to build your Archmage, it's going to end up really good, because just the skeleton of the class is incredibly powerful, with a lot of escapes and utility that you can use with any element. But to me, at first glance, Earth is just not as exciting, because first of all, you usually utilize Stone Wall and Pulverizing Augur on every Archmage, as well as Stone Skin, so you are already using 3 out of the starting talents, and at least to me, it just doesn't feel as good to be a mage casting spells and then you are dealing physical damage, the same damage type as if you were playing Berserker. But then, what about water or ice? You don't take these talents on the other Archmage archetypes, and throwing ice spells on mages is a fantasy classic. So why does this have a bad reputation? Well, Ice Archmage is the only archetype that does not get a beam. Instead, you get Ice Shards, which throws projectiles at enemies. It is not strictly worse than beams. For example, in a situation like this, with a beam, I could only hit 3 enemies, but Ice Shards sends out the projectiles in a radius 1, so it's going to send out 5 projectiles. And the first 2 enemies are going to take a lot of damage, but the 3 enemies in the back will take 0 damage. So it depends on luck. If this is the unique that you want to kill, Ice Shards is incredible. If the unique is in the back, Ice Shards doesn't do anything. Generally, I think a beam is better, but honestly not by that much. The worst part of it is that it's not a particularly fast projectile. It's 800% of base speed, which means if an enemy is in range 10, the projectile will only travel 8 tiles, so the enemy has time to maybe move out of the way or teleport forwards and dodge all of the damage. Also keep in mind, if you do try Ice Archmage, in the starting Archmage zone, projectiles are heavily slowed down, so it's going to feel much worse than in the rest of the game. The way you work around this projectile problem is with Ice Archmage's defining feature, freezing enemies. When enemies are frozen, they are mostly harmless. They will not be able to attack you, they first have to break the ice block, and because the AI in Tales of Maj'Eyal is very straightforward, it uses its best, most powerful talents first. When you freeze an enemy, they will use those best talents to break the ice block, so even if they manage to get out, they will be much less dangerous. Unfortunately, it is not all upside. By default, only 60% of damage done to a frozen enemy goes to their health, while 40% will be done to the ice block. This is a fairly severe damage penalty, but thankfully it's only temporary, because from level 22 you can start putting points into Utter Cold, which eventually removes this damage penalty entirely, letting you deal full damage to frozen enemies. Freeze in this game, for whatever reason, is resisted by stun immunity, which would be pretty bad, because a lot of the dangerous enemies would be entirely immune to your special mechanic. But this is where the Wet debuff comes in, which halves the enemy's stun immunity, and because you have multiple ways of freezing your enemies, you'll be able to frequently freeze enemies with 50% stun immunity fairly easily. On top of that, a lot of the talents interact with the wet debuff, dealing more damage. The second talent is Glacial Vapor. This creates a low damage over time area. It's thankfully pretty cheap with only 12 mana cost, so you will throw it out there, but it's a pretty forgettable talent. The best part about it is that it's a radius 3 with range 8, which means if an enemy is in range 11, you can still use Glacial Vapor to damage it and pull it to attack you. Then you get Tidal Wave. It slowly expands away from you in an AoE, doing a little bit of cold and physical damage, but the best part about it is that it applies the wet debuff. Unfortunately, because it only works in very short range, you often can't use it. Then the last talent, Shivgoroth form, transforms you into an ice elemental. It gives you Ice Storm, an extra talent, full immunity to bleed and stun, cold resistance, and all cold damage heals you for over 100% of the damage done. Now, when I read this, to me, it sounds like the cold damage that I deal to enemies will heal me. It will basically have lifesteal. And I thought, oh my god, it's incredible. And finally, there is some synergy with Arcane Shield. And maybe these two talents can work together and constantly give me big shields based on the ice damage. But this is not how this talent works. Instead, what it does is give you cold affinity. This is a pretty rare stat, and for good reason, because it's extremely powerful. It heals you based on the damage you take. So if I take 100 cold damage, I would heal for 118 health. But cold damage is not very common, so this ends up not actually being that good, in my opinion. You can of course stand in your own AoEs to get some healing, but even then, on Archmage, you should never really be taking health damage anyways. You should always have a damage shield up, and if you don't, you should run away. So I was really disappointed by this talent because I don't really see a lot of reason to run it. The stun immunity is of course good, and with some spell cooldown reduction, in the late game you can have this turned on forever. But by that point you already have to solve stun immunity in a different way, and I've learned from experience not to rely on temporary effects for the most important stats like stun immunity. The Ice Storm talent is pretty good, but it's again only in radius 3, so a lot of the time you will be too far away for it to have any effect. So the water category, not too impressive, but as you can see from my investment in the ice tree, it gets better. Freeze is a single target nuke that also freezes the enemy. Very simple, very powerful, range 10. This will become your opener against every enemy that does not have stun immunity. Then you get some real AoE in Frozen Ground, but what really sucks about this talent is that it's so bad at the beginning. With Radius 2, it feels really bad to use, but eventually, at Radius 7, this talent is awesome. Pin immunity is pretty rare, but really good against any melee enemy. If they can't reach you, they can't deal damage to you. And while this does not put the enemies in an ice block, it still counts as freezing them, which is important for Shatter. This does damage to any frozen enemy in your line of sight, and it also applies the wet effect to any affected enemies. So, if something is stun immune, you just open with freeze, then you shatter, this applies wet, and now your spells will deal more damage. It's all good. But if they are stun immune, you want to open with frozen ground, pin them, then you can shatter, apply the wet effect, and then you can try to freeze them with the reduced stun immunity. Unfortunately, shatter is also not that great until you put more points into it, because it has a limit on how many enemies it can affect. So if you walk into a big room, there can be 10, 15 enemies, and you do frozen ground into shatter, you might not shatter the targets that you want. Even maxed out at 9 enemies hit, it still doesn't always hit every enemy. So that's a little annoying, which is sort of the motto for Ice Archmage. It's not really that much worse than all the other categories. There are just these little annoying parts that make it feel a little worse to play, especially at the beginning. Also, when I read Shatter, I thought that this would destroy the ice block, but fortunately, it does not remove either the pin or the ice block, the enemy stays frozen, so there's no downside to using this. And Utter Cold we already talked about. Every Archmage element gets a sustain like this, almost capping your Cold Pen, some extra damage, and the ability to ignore ice block damage reduction. So it's fine, as every Archmage is. But as I was playing, I realized that my ability to freeze enemies and make them unable to fight back didn't really feel all that different from playing any other Archmage. And then I realized that's because Mirror Image exists, which is a talent you should take on every single Archmage. It summons a copy of you that will last for many turns, it instantly taunts the enemy, so you are completely safe, and it can only lose 1 life per turn. So when you use it, and the enemy uses its flurry, or lightning bolts, flame shocks on it, it doesn't care. It will survive all of that, keep occupying the enemy's attention, and unfortunately it's even better than freeze, because it works against every single enemy, no matter their immunities. Freezing enemies is still really good. Sometimes your mirror image might be down, and then there's one final big annoyance to deal with. Ice Archmage can't actually win the game, at least not by using ice spells, because you know how I said that Shivgora form, it's really good against ice damage, makes you immune to ice damage, but who cares about that? Well, there's one enemy in this game that has Shivgora form on like effective talent level 100, so they can keep it up almost permanently, and that's the final boss of the game, Elandar. In this form, it is impossible to kill him with ice damage, which is a problem considering that's the only damage type that my character does. But, thankfully, there are ways around it. You can use Disperse Magic to try and remove it from him. I've already tried this against some mages in the Orc Prides. It works, but those Orc mages have like 3 sustains and 1 buff on them, so it's easy to hit the Shivgora form. Unfortunately, Elandar has like 50 sustains and 50 different buffs, so I might not be able to hit it. But thankfully, there's also a backup plan with Energy Alteration, which converts all of your damage into a different damage type. So it turns out Elandar never used Shivgora form, and he had plenty of time to use it, like 4, 5, 6 turns where he wasn't frozen, and he just never clicked the button. I don't think I've ever seen this. I feel like he always does it as one of the first actions, but I'm very happy that it ended up this way, because, of course, I forgot to put the points into the sustain that converts my damage into a different damage type, so if he did transform, it would have been a problem. But he didn't, so everything went smoothly. It was one of the more comfortable final bosses. I just kept freezing them over and over, and very quickly killed them. There's actually one more problem that I forgot to complain about. There are so many cold resistant or even immune enemies in the tier 1 and tier 2 dungeons. It's ridiculous. Usually it's just like the little dragons, but here it's like the elementals, and there's water imps are immune, and the boss in Daikara is also entirely immune to cold damage. And these enemies are beatable once you get Utter Cold. You can eventually punch through them, but it takes a lot of mana, a lot of effort, and you might have to skip some enemies that you just won't be able to kill, at least until you can max out your Utter Cold. For my race, I went Shalor, because it's just really good, and synergizes extremely well with Archmage. You get global speed, spell crit and crit multi, spell sustain to protect your other good sustains, and then one of the best talents in the game in Timeless, removing all debuffs, reducing all your cooldowns. It doesn't get much better than this. For stats you will go Magic for spell power and damage, second you go Willpower because it gives you mana, third Cunning for crit chance, and the fourth stat is Dexterity for the reduced damage from criticals to help against critical hits, which will give you much more survivability in the late game than if you went into Constitution for the maximum life. I decided to fully commit to the Ice Mage archetype, so I maxed out Ice Shards early. This is 90% of the damage you are going to be dealing for a pretty long time. You should use Mana Thrust or even put a point into Pulverizing Augur if you find you need more damage, this will not do much, but it will give you something to cast in the turns that Ice Shards is on cooldown. You should also try to find a tool that will help you deal more damage, so either one of the Lightning Storm ones that also stun enemies, those are super good, or even just one of the tools that shoots a bolt of damage, anything to help you get through the early game. Later on I even used item actives like Gwei's Burninator. I've never used this item in my entire life, but it came quite handy on this character. The two staple defensive options on every Archmage are Temporal Shield. I like putting 2 points here just for that 50 extra health. Then you can just put it on autocast when you enter combat. It's not optimal, but it's a lazy solution, and because of the long duration, you can get away with it. Then also make sure to turn on Phantasmal Shield. With the category point, you pick up an extra inscription. Then make sure to pick up combat training from Last Hope for thick skin and light armor training. Once you get points into Mirror Image and in Disruption Shield, which will be additional defensive layers, I think it's nice to save up a couple of points until level 20. So once you get the category point, you can put it into Ice and immediately get all these good talents and 3 points in Frozen Ground, so that it doesn't stay at 2 range. For generics, I usually like Rushing Premonition as well as Essence of Speed, but I struggled with mana a lot more than on the other Archmages I've played, partly because I also took Essence of Speed early, so I lost 120 mana there, which I don't really recommend. I don't think you need it that early. So you can go for Premonition, it's a really good sustain, and you don't have anything else important to put points into, but the 120 mana is costly. Your other option is to just put 4 points into shielding to get that 1 turn of extra duration on all shields, which I found pretty useful. Your next target is maxing out Utter Cold for the Cold Pen and ignoring ice blocks. Then I think it's time to go for Essence of Speed. 4 points is a good breakpoint, and you should also make Frozen Ground its best possible version with Radius 7. The generics I think are self-explanatory, just about thick skin. You need to save gear with Constitution for it, and whenever possible, you should always put points into thick skin until it's maxed. Your first sustain will be Ethereal Form if you want to play it safe. This will require an effective defense of 40, which again might require some item swapping and manipulation, or going to shops and trying to find items that have higher defense. One tip I can give you to try and get that last bit of defense: light armor training gives you extra defense if you move next to an enemy. It doesn't mean moving to the square next to the enemy, you have to be next to the enemy and then move adjacent to them, and this can help you get to that 40 defense. Ethereal Form is just one of the best all-rounder prodigies in the game. This and Utter Cold will cap your cold penetration, so you don't have to worry about it ever again, and it gives you 25% absolute damage resistance, which just makes you a lot harder to kill. The alternative is Arcane Amplification Drone, which you usually take on Archmage because it's incredibly powerful and it works especially well with beams. Now, I thought that Ice Mage doesn't really work well with this prodigy because the drone is immune to debuffs, so you can't freeze it, damage over time doesn't trigger it, so it just might not work very well. But just now I did some testing and it's still probably the best or second best prodigy you can take. It actually works quite well with the ice shards because it will always give you an extra target, and also for some reason you can freeze it. So if you do Frozen Ground into Shatter, both of those spells will work on the drone, rippling the damage, and the damage is something that Ice Mage struggles with in this portion of the game, and good offense is often the best defense in Tales of Maj'Eyal. So if I played the character again, I would take Arcane Amplification Drone on level 25, and then only later take Ethereal Form on level 42. By level 40, I maxed out all the ice spells for maximum power, and I prepared to go into Earth for Stonewall next. With the category, you pick up your last inscription, and then whatever generic points you prefer. Some people like playing with probability travel. I personally never use this talent to great effect. Some people like teleport. I don't really use it. You have enough generic points to pick up whatever you like. One decent option is that you can just max out Grace of the Eternals to get the lower cooldown, which, especially if you use Timeless, you might actually get to use this twice in prolonged combat. And then finally, once you get Vermbile, I just realized that I actually took a meta on 34 and used the Vermbile on the last Inscription, because Spellcraft is very powerful for the cooldown reduction and for the spell shock, so swap those two around. But to be honest, Archmage is such a flexible class. There are so many good talents and you just can't take them all. Like for example, you could entirely ignore Stonewall, save these 7 points and just use Time Prison, which is in functionality not all that different from Stonewall, but this is one approach that works. For the second Prodigy, I actually took Draconic Will, because I didn't think Arcane Amplification Drone would be good, and this is sort of a luxury Prodigy. It's really nice, especially in the Orc Prides, or just fighting mages in the late game, where they have so much spell power that they apply Spell Shock to you, reducing your resistances by 20%, and you have to cleanse it every turn, otherwise you take a lot more damage. Draconic Will takes care of that, and it just provides you so much safety from debuffs, together with Mirror Image, and keeping them frozen. With that being said, I think Arcane Amplification Drone and Ethereal Form should be the two Prodigies that you take. Either order works. Taking this first is more defensive, you will be much less likely to die to burst damage, but you will encounter some struggles with mana problems, because it will take you longer to kill things, and Arcane Amplification Drone is the opposite. Tons of damage, much less defense. One of the biggest swings in how this character felt to play was getting above 33% spell cooldown reduction. This means you can't just put points into Spellcraft, you will need cooldown reduction somewhere on your gear. Perhaps the easiest way to get it is on your boots. There's a greater modifier that gives you 10% spell cooldown reduction, and this will take your ice shards to just a cooldown of 2, and it makes the character play so much better, because before you have a lot of downtime where all of your ice spells are on cooldown and you're having to use random active items or just pass turns, but after getting above that 33% you almost always have something to cast, and from that point on you should feel really powerful. Mana problems. So since it might take you longer to kill enemies, especially before you get Utter Cold, usually I think of it like this. 300 mana is like the bare minimum. If you have below 300, you should probably turn off some of your sustains so that you get above. With 300, you can get a couple of spell rotations off. It's doable, but not ideal. 500 mana, I feel like, is the comfortable minimum, especially for the later game. That's what I had for most of the game, and only now, when I crafted my gear, I managed to reach 750, which should be more than enough, especially because I do not run any mana regeneration on my Archmage. This is definitely not the only way to play, but in my experience, you should be able to end most fights before you run out of mana, and anti-magic enemies are really only a problem in Gorbet Pride, but you can play around it with Mirror Image. If you cast this first, before they get a chance to act, they will cast their mana drain on the Mirror Image, and you'll be perfectly fine. I do have a Mana Surge rune in my inventory, just if something horrible happened and I couldn't leave the zone. I kept this as an option, although I would probably be dead at that point. There is also a staff modifier of channeling that gives you an active similar to the Mana Surge rune, so you can just have a staff in your inventory and equip it when you need more mana. Although I think there's a cooldown when you equip an item before you can use the active. It's not ideal, but it's better than just dying without any mana. Or just don't be greedy and run the Mana Surge rune always. Also alongside the mana management, I must mention this about Disruption Shield. All this talent does is that it gives you extra HP. It's a permanent shield, but if you ever drop below 50% mana, it immediately stops functioning. But on the UI, if you drop below 50% mana, it will still show the shield protecting you. This is not the case. If I would take 1000 damage right now, it would kill me. The shield would not block a single point of damage. For the inscriptions, I run a movement as always. On Archmages, it's good to run a shield rune of any kind, because you get increased shields through this sustain. Then I like keeping a Wild Mental Infusion. This will allow you to cleanse Silence, if it ever happens. Then a Shatter and Dissipation. to clear sustains from some of the late game bosses. Disperse Magic is a nice bonus, but not really enough for me to stop running Dissipation Rune. For the items, if you are completely lost, I made a whole video on general itemization that is linked in the description, but for the late game, you're aiming for the usual: increased cold damage, critical multiplier, spell crit chance, get it as close to 100% as possible, spell power, again you're ideally aiming for 100, enough spell cooldown reduction so that Ice Shards is on a 2-turn cooldown, and then as many resistances as you can get. You can see that I have 84 defense, which comes mostly just from the Prodigy, and 84 is a respectable amount, allowing me to dodge a decent amount of attacks. An extra good item modifier is spell power on crit. This can stack up to 3 times, and in the late game you stack it up very quickly, so it's good to pick up whenever you can find it. Then you should also try to find some increased maximum mana, is pretty crucial. Daktun's Gauntlets are here just for the crit multi, here's some more mana. Willpower is basically just mana, the spell cooldown on boots, and then my jewelry is some of the worst I've ever had, with a below average Wheel of Fate and just a Bloodstone Voratun ring. I didn't drop a single tier 4 or tier 5 orange cloth armor, so I'm just using this purple one. This is pretty much your best item slot on Archmage, so it's pretty disappointing, but what can you do? Your ideal late game setup is with a one-handed staff and probably Life Drinker. It's difficult to get a better caster offhand than this. It gives good stats, and it gives a very good spell proc. Blood Grasp does some extra damage, and it gives you extra maximum life, giving you some extra survivability. There are some items that are clearly specifically aimed at Ice Archmage, like this Frostlord's Chain, but unfortunately they are not too impressive. Also, speaking of Life Drinker, it gives you Wormrot, and this is another one of those talents that I've never used from Life Drinker, because I usually have plenty of better talents, but this doesn't put all of your other charms on cooldown, which a lot of active abilities do. So if you ever have time, you can use this. Not exactly for the damage, but it removes a beneficial physical effect every turn, which can be useful in rare cases. Other than that, you are looking to pick up Track from Escorts, and then Magic or Willpower. Chant of Fortress from Sun Paladins will give you some extra physical resistance. I actually took this twice. It's giving me 16% physical damage resist, which is very nice. And in terms of the Alchemists, I took class points, then spell critical chance, then +3 willpower and magic, then I would take +3 cunning or dexterity. I found no need for generic points, you get more than enough, and I already spent a lot of them in places where they don't need to be, like the extra points in this invisibility, teleport. For my playstyle, I'm perfectly fine keeping it at a single point. Probability travel. The way I've decided to use this, or not use this, is that I don't actually sustain it, but if I ever find myself in a position where I have no other escape tools, I can always spend a turn to click on it and then move through a wall. Unfortunately, you can't move through walls in here, but you get the idea. So, can Ice Archmage beat the game? Yes. Is it the worst Archmage archetype? I mean, maybe? Honestly, Arcane might just be worse, but it doesn't really matter. All of them are incredibly powerful still, especially if you combine them with Arcane Amplification Drone. I think I'm playing a much weaker version because I took the more defensive Prodigies. So yeah, hopefully I didn't actually die to the final boss, otherwise this would be a little awkward, but if I did, you probably wouldn't be watching this video, so hopefully right now on your screen, it's me dealing the finishing blow to Argoniel as the official proof Ice Archmage doesn't deserve its reputation, it's still extremely powerful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.